truth.
No chaser. Addiction is one of those things that just doesn't make sense. It's irrational. If you scanned a person's normal brain and you scanned an addicted person's brain, typically you're going to see activity operating in different ways in the person with an addiction. This is something that's been studied for decades. And what I think there's still a lot of things that people don't know about addiction, but what we do know is that it is a disease. And there are many layers to this. One is for those people who, well, let me start by saying this. There is a substance dependence, and then there's substance abuse. So addicts fall in the dependence category, where your body becomes chemically dependent. There's also psychological dependence, and you may see that more with marijuana or more some gateway drugs. But when it comes to substances like heroin, cocaine, crack, and some behaviors that create a chemical reaction in your body, gambling, sex, other shopping for some people. Those are things that trigger what's happening biochemically in your brain, which leads to addiction. And that's why comments like, well, why don't they just stop? Or, well, if they had more willpower, if they were stronger, you're not weak-minded. This kind of behavior is only for those who are weak-minded, because it is a disease, because it is a chemical imbalance. It is impactful. And then there are life issues that can really impact the connection with substances. A lot of people with trauma, a lot of people with anxiety and depression, that you will find that those are the things that they use to self-medicate and to escape, particularly with trauma. If there's a significant trauma that hasn't been addressed, then substances are an absolute go-to to be able to escape those traumas. Excuse me. And so being able to just be very clear, this is a disease. It is an absolute disease. It is connected to chemical imbalance. And it's not something that you can just get over. It's something you have to have some intention around. Alcohol is just one of those pieces. There's food addiction, there's nicotine, all of those are connected to addiction. And what's really, when they're illegal substances like a cocaine or heroin, or right now marijuana, that's going to be legal at some point, I believe, across this country. But with any of those things, you do have legal consequences for addicts when they're in the realm of illegal substances. What's different for alcohol, for gambling, for food, for nicotine? Those aren't illegal. So legal consequences don't really apply to that. So it's easier the losses aren't as immediate and they aren't as great. And so certainly companies want to make money. So yeah, I think there's laws have happened over the years because people were dying from DUIs. People were dying from alcohol-induced types of behaviors and acting out. And so, yes, you see now these microscopic warnings that those things can be habit-forming or certain things like that. But I think that with those types of addictions, it really becomes more and more, it's a little more difficult because it's not typical that you're going to go to a barbecue and people are just going to be shooting up heroin.
Right.
So alcohol is everywhere.
So it's so accessible.
It's so accessible. Nicotine is everywhere. Yeah. So if you're food, you need it to live. And so those are those substances. And usually, also, what I'll say is you will oftentimes see an addict have a bit of a transfer from one drug to another. So, if let's say someone's been using crack for a certain amount of time and they get clean from crack, but then, they have those addictive types of behaviors that may lead to maybe where they transfer that addiction into alcohol, into something that's a little more socially acceptable, socially acceptable, but still can have some significant consequences. So it can be really challenging living with those kinds of addictions that are socially acceptable and that are everywhere.
All right. One of our interviewees touched on genetic disposition. He talked about his gambling addiction and that he later found out his mother and her mother both dealt with the same addiction, amongst other things. Can you touch on genetic disposition for those of us whose parents are addicts or recovering addicts?
Absolutely. This still goes back to that whole point about it being a medical brain issue. It is a disease. What you will also often see is that addiction can skip a generation. But if you do, a lot of times what I do with my clients is I have them do what's called the genogram. And that is really basically a family tree that is with intention around certain dynamics in the family, addiction being one of them. It is, an addiction, I think is important to say, is that it affects so many people. It's very common. And so all of our families, everybody in this room, if we do a family tree, there's going to be addiction in that family tree somewhere. But there is a genetic predisposition to substances. So if you have a grandmother or a grandfather that struggled with addiction, it is likely that it will show up in some form at some point. Now, when you add trauma, when you add certain attitudes around substances, when you have different types of other mental health issues, mood disorders such as depression and anxiety, those are likely to be more significant and severe addictions. Part of what makes an addiction is the compulsivity of it. It is where you gravitate to it, you're engaged in it without a lot of consideration or thought around it. And if you continue to use despite the consequences, that's when you know it's an addiction. And there is absolutely predisposition to that genetically.
So just to piggyback off of her question, I then want to ask, because I heard you say genetic, but I wanted to know if it was, because I think there's a difference, genetic makeup or generational curse. You understand what I'm saying? Because clinically, can an addiction be tied to a genetic makeup passed down, or just something that just plagued your family? I learned behavior because one of our the same interviewee that she was referring to, he mentioned that his mom was a gambler and her mom was a gambler, and afterwards we kind of had an off-camera moment where we realized it's one of those things that can be picked up inadvertently. Simple things, going to the store back in the days, running getting numbers for your grandparents, or playing the midday lotto, or things of that nature. And honestly, I've done those things, but I've just been blessed enough to not have been cursed with the habit. I didn't become an avid gambler behind it. However, it's somebody that might not be as fortunate. So that's what makes me wonder if clinically it can be proven that it's a genetic makeup, or if it's a generational curse. Which would you?
So That is, I think there's so many pieces and components. One, because nothing is ever really, one thing does not look like another, so to speak. Everyone's different. Every family's different. Every experience is different. And I do think what you're talking about is very different, yet at the same time, very much the same, right? So there certainly are the genetic predispositions. That's clinically proven. That's an absolute thing. But then what you're speaking, I think, comes alongside of that and sometimes can stand alone in that with generationally what's happening. So we talked about attitudes towards certain things at first. I have family members that they've been around drug use all their life. They grew up seeing it. It was impactful. I had an uncle who was a heroin user, and I remember walking in on him shooting up at a very young age. And while I had no idea what it was, I still now, I'm an old lady now, but then I was a little girl, and I remember that feeling. I remember being afraid. I remember that he looked different. He physically looked different when he was using. He was a whole nother person. So there were pieces that were generationally, I think, passed down because there were these attitudes and a way of life. But then if you think about people who are living in this chronic stress and these situations where people are limited in their choices, like you mentioned that you had some choices, things shifted for you, things turned a corner for you. That doesn't necessarily happen for everyone. And that kind of supports that whole generational family systems kind of thing, where if you're already predisposed to an addiction, there is going to be another component of where generationally what family is looking like, what's happening with your family is going to impact that as well. So again, it's multi-layered. One can stand by itself, but it's not unusual for them to coincide with each other. And I think particularly from a spiritual standpoint, generational curses are those things that they're strongholds because we don't address them. We aren't informed about it. And so we continue to live these things out without any attention to it or intention around it because we kind of don't know what to do with it. And so if that happens, it's going to repeat one generation after another. Is that kind of answer?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, okay. Since he had the phone, I was going to go ahead and try to do a question.
Now, I don't know if that made any sense because I was looking like he needs you. I
know.
I was trying to.
Made a lot of sense.
Oh, absolutely. You see, I was in tune. I was going to throw another question in there that I just thought in my head.
Yeah, please.
That's it. That's what
Please.
Talking about codependency.
Oh, big one.
I was thinking about it. I was like, I know behaviors, physical makeup can be passed down generation. But I didn't think a habit could. You know what I'm saying? As far as and that's what made me ask the question. We were asking when I was talking to the gambler.
Ashley got a question next?
Yeah.
Let's roll on to that. Phone battery. I mean, not phone battery.
Oh.
Camera batteries.
My bad.
Oh, you're fine.
I mean, trying not to change. I mean, we got to change them out. But if we can shoot on the current battery, that'd be great.
Are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you believe support groups such as NA, AA, or GA are necessary in order to reach sobriety?
Absolutely. And let me tell you why. Because addiction particularly when a person is trying to manage that in their families, in their lives, it can be a very lonely place. And so what support groups do is they normalize it for people. And so you have all these people with very similar, not exactly the same, but similar experiences. And it is a place where they can go that they, one, don't feel alone. And you know the power that it is when you feel like you're struggling and something is horribly wrong with you and you have turned away from all the love that you have, and you've hurt people and disappointed people. You're in a space with people who've had those same experiences. That is extremely powerful and healing. So that is really how AA started out as Alcoholics Anonymous, and really grew into so many other components. And of course, there are certain steps that you have in that kind of philosophy to really help you confront your addiction, and it provides support with other people walking through those steps, and it also provides sponsorship. So someone else who has a significant amount of time sober excuse me, who's been sober, they are able to provide support and be a 24-hour resource when you're struggling. Part of recovery oftentimes is addiction. And I know that that's kind of crazy to hear. Sometimes you have to know how you mess up and how you fall back into those destructive habits so that you can really be clear about what to do differently. And so your sponsor and that community of people, they are there to pick you up when you fall. They're there to support you in those times. So there's a lot of power, and it's extremely helpful to find those places of support groups, particularly in those alcoholic 12, well, and really what we call them is 12-step groups. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous.
Yeah, definitely happy that you mentioned that, because that's exactly where I was going. Saying interviewee, I just, and this is not for you to debunk any of his feelings or anything like that. He completely is against support groups.
Okay.
Because he feels that they are a bit chastising in the sense of, and the 12-step program is one of the examples that he did use, because how else do I feel if I don't complete my program in 12 steps? And the only place I'm left to feel is a failure, which would probably send me back into the downward spiral that I was trying to get out of, you know, if I only reached step 9 or 10. And I'm not trying to compare it, but hey,
sure.
you know, as a lifetime fat boy, I definitely get the goal, the mission, to meet a goal. And then we've all dieted, and if we don't have, if we have a certain weight that we're expected to be at a certain time, and we don't get it, then we could either press on and say, you know what, I'm gonna keep going. We just take it on the chin, or we relapse. You understand what I'm saying? And then next thing you know comes ice cream, and then comes the cake, and then comes everything, and then you're back where you started. And that is what he did not like about the support groups. So I mean, I felt he had an interesting point. You know, I never really looked at it that way. You know, but
so yeah, I love that, and let me tell you why. Everything isn't for everyone, even though those 12-step programs have been around and was started by actually an alcoholic. And forgive me, I can't remember, but it was way, I don't know, 40s, maybe earlier than that. I don't know the exact date. But one, everything isn't for everyone. But two, I think it's also important to have the right kind of group. While every group follows the 12 steps, the structure of them may vary. And I think it's important that people can work your steps, but you you really kind of work them ideally at your own pace, and still the other components like having a sponsor, having someone there to support you and challenge you, quite honestly, is another benefit. So I think it is about finding what's right. I think the bottom line is that if you keep doing the same things and expecting different results, you stay where you are, right? And so if you're wanting to be in recovery and manage your addiction in a healthy way, 12-step programs are absolutely a viable option. But if it doesn't fit for you, because it may not, what then do you do to maintain your sobriety? Because you already know that the expectation that you can do it on your own is not really a realistic expectation, and it's a setup for failure. And that and addiction is that cycle. It's like there is whatever promotes and triggers you to use, then the high and all the benefits you get from the use. But then when you come down and the devastation of what you come down and what you have to face and the guilt and the shame and the humiliation of that makes you just want to use again. And so it's this constant cycle. And if you can imagine the power of that, because, and what 12-step does, what therapy does, what rehab does, rehabilitation programs, substance abuse treatment programs, what they do is they give you tools to break that cycle, to give you, so when you feel this, when you see this trigger coming, you already know that that's an opportunity. It leaves the door open for you to use. So you know that now that you know that, what are some things you can have in place for you to utilize so you don't fall into that? And that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So whether it's 12-step, if that doesn't work, it works for a lot. And I think it's really helpful to find support groups and support systems where people can engage together, that have like experiences, similar experiences. But what are you going to do different so you can get something different?
Okay.
One of our participants touched on cross addiction. Can you explain cross addiction, and does it affect most addicts?
So that's what I talked about earlier, about that transfer where there are multiple. I think, and I want to say, I'm not an absolute. I've worked in substance abuse for years. I would not consider myself to be an absolute expert. And the science and research around this is changing constantly. But what cross addiction is where when you really are using a variety of substances, and it's sometimes folks have a drug of choice, but oftentimes there are, if you're chasing a high, do you really care where that high comes from? And so you may be willing to do, and you're impaired. That's the other piece. So again, you're not rational with your substances. So if there's something that is going to create that high and that feeling and that escape for you, you're likely going to be willing to get that from anything. So your drug of choice may be cocaine, but you may be a constant drinker where you consistently are drinking as well. Or if you're getting drug tested and you know this stays in your system for a certain amount of time, you may tip on over here and use this. So it can be very fluid in the way that people are using their substances. And so that's more in line with that cross addiction and how it just kind of melds into each other.
And along with cross addiction, we don't want to, pretend to be doctors and self-diagnose and things of that nature. One of our interviewees had mentioned suicidal ideations, right?
Yeah.
And the issue is with him, he started off with his addiction of gambling very high. That was almost like the gift and the curse for him. He said, you know, and he started off hot and he stayed hot for a while, to where he almost didn't see himself losing. And then when the inevitable happened, you know, it was a downward, and he contemplated suicide to where he was losing everything: family, friends, money, houses, so on and so forth.
Right.
However, he also dived into a deeper rooted issue with us, which was his past. And he had a lot of traumatic, you know, experiences with friends, family, so on and so forth. And he also suffered from PTSD, being a veteran. So that's similar to the last question. Just in listening to him, it kind of made me wonder whether the suicidal ideations came from losing it all, or was it more from the service, or you understand what I'm saying, or maybe from the experiences of him growing up.
So what I think, again, one of the pieces with that is addiction is almost always, if not always, connected to another mental health issue. It is what we would call a dual diagnosis. So there's a diagnosis of addiction, and then there's another diagnosis, and in that case, post-traumatic stress disorder and probably depression, which goes hand in hand with with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in that case, you can't, that first high or the highest high that you felt, there is a chase for that. Oftentimes you will hear addicts kind of talk about that and what it's like to be, what that does. So it's almost like if you've not felt great your whole life, you don't know really what's going on, but just don't feel like everybody else. You just feel different. You're not as happy. You don't get why people are so happy or how people are so chill and relaxed and calm, and then you get high and you feel like everybody else. That's why they're happy. That's why they're so chill. But when you're not high anymore, you go back to that. Whatever the high is, whether it's a substance, whether it's a behavior, but you go back to that. It's going to be really, really difficult to try to live life not feeling normal in a lot of ways. And so substances, those behaviors, they really help to escape in some ways from that feeling, or helping you to feel normal in some senses. And so that and what you're talking about, that trauma that probably was never addressed, or if you even knew it was trauma. A lot of times we go through stuff we don't even know it's trauma, particularly in the African American community. And that kind of goes back to that generational stuff we talked about earlier as well, because we are a people that kind of just put one foot in front of the other. We just kind of keep going because our history has been traumatic. That's one thing we know how to do, is function in the midst of trauma. But what that does is, I think it hinders us from knowing and having the insight and awareness that it is a trauma. We have to do something about that, because we're just trying to function and function in a normal way. So those two items, typically two aspects, often coexist with that mental health issue, be it the trauma, be it depression, be it anxiety, with the addiction. And really having some awareness and understanding about how they do impact each other. So I hope that answered your question. Okay.
In your expertise, can you touch on codependency and elaborate on some of the effects one's parents' addiction may have on?
So codependency is really, that's a whole different topic in and of itself. One, because it can look like so many different things. And basically, because someone else is dependent, you have a dependence on that same thing because of their dependence. So while you may not be the substance user, everything that user does affects you. And so there are support groups around specific codependency. There's a 12-step program specific to codependency. There's a wealth of information because it is so impactful, and it teaches us how to engage in relationships, because the idea is that you have your role, how you show loyalty, how you show love, how you show commitment to that person is showing up in their impaired state, whatever. And that's not necessarily whether they're under the influence impaired, but that they are actively connected to their addiction. And not when you grow, particularly as children, but even as a partner, even as a parent of someone, your life shifts greatly, and you either flow with the addiction or you remove yourself from the addiction. And either of those choices are life-changing choices. And you don't always know how to do that because we don't have a lot of information about it. And then it's heartbreaking because you know that this person isn't who you need them to be in your life. And it's hard to know why. And particularly for children, the narrative becomes they chose that over me, which is not theoretically what it is, but emotionally it feels like that. And that truly shapes how you begin to feel about yourself as a person. So your relationships then are determined by that aspect. Your ability to trust people is therefore determined by that aspect because there's a constant narrative about their substance abuse and then who you are in the midst of that use. And that's why it's so important that children of addicts, partners of addicts, parents of addicts, anyone who's affected directly by someone's substance use, that you get the support and the awareness that you need so that you're clear on how to not be shaped in those negative ways by that person's substance use. And again, that's just a microcosm of codependency, where our lives are just shaped and altered by someone else's use. Helpful?
Yes.
Very.
Okay.
Yes. So you touched on the trust and
Yeah.
was that the effects one's parents' addiction may have?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Safety in relationships,
That's what I was-
abusive
can you elaborate
relationship.
on that?
Mm-hmm.
What's wrong?
No,
That one's out of space. Out of space. You know how much longer this one has?
Well, this one's recording the whatchamacallit, so it has more space, but
Okay.
I just want to conserve it, get it all out for the battery so it's run out.
Okay.
So, ready, and go ahead.
Oh, do you want, yes, I'm sorry. So this is a separate question. Can you elaborate on some of the effects one's parents' addiction may have on them?
So if you think about part of a parent's role for a child is to create safety, to create security, to create a level of predictability, to create structure, and to have good judgment in parenting. And if you think about what addiction is, it's none of those primarily if their predominant parent is an active addict and actively using. So I should say that, not an active addict, an actively using addict. Then you don't have any of those things. And so it's almost like shattered glass. If we shatter a mirror and you look in it, the image, the image is familiar, but it's very skewed and distorted, right? Very much to sexual abuse is very much the same, because there is abuse and neglect that comes with that, because the parent is impaired and they aren't able to give you what you need. And so what you have to do is figure out the pieces that are missing. So you have to depend on yourself. You have to become the roles reverse in some ways, where you take care of the parent in some ways, and they aren't taking care of you. If there's a parent that's not really in the home and they're not predominant, children still are very much aware that they aren't as engaged or involved or active the way that they need to be. So it can set up a lot of trust issues. It could set up a lot of self-esteem issues, because you don't feel valuable. If my parent can't love me, who in the world's gonna love me? So I can accept a lot of things because really I'm unlovable, because the person that was supposed to love me could not love me, and they chose this over me. And so and the list kind of goes on and on and on. There's so many pieces and parts with children of addiction, and particularly the type of addiction it is, because again, trauma, it could lead to a lot of trauma. Children are violated at a higher rate when parents are impaired. You don't have structure, and you're not very stable if you may be moving around, because you can't really keep a job if you're actively using. So there's so many components that rob children of what they need to have that hierarchy of needs met as a child and feel safe and feel secure. So who can you trust if you can't trust your mama, if you can't trust your dad? Who can you trust? And that's imprinted at a very young age. It's hard to shift that when that becomes the narrative so young.
Good.
This is the last one.
Yeah. So this last portion really is not a question at all, just advice for your brother.
Okay,
right?
all right.
Because I had a realization while interviewing my father that he wasn't clean for as long as I originally thought. While 21 years is an accomplishment, I have a younger sister who is now 24. And that means that, he was still getting high while she was an infant.
Right.
In which he off camera told me a story that he meant to say on camera, which I won't say here, but it kind of brought me back to some of that original resentment, and I'm 40, but not old enough, too old for advice, because I the same resentment that I felt when I was 15 when I found out that my dad was absent because of crack cocaine. All the times just my mom, proverbial, my mom kind of holding him down, and well, your dad, he didn't want to be with me anymore, and this and blah, 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 and she wasn't really keeping it real with me about his addiction until shout out to her. She didn't want to badmouth him.
Exactly.
You understand what I'm saying? Which we have way too much of that today, right? So, but when I was around 14, 15, when I found out the real reason is when I really, because I always looked at people who were drug addicts as, that's what I had to look at in the neighborhood, and those were the people that we kind of looked down upon, so I put him in the same bracket, and now here we are, 15 years later, and, well, no, longer than that, right? What's that, so anyway, 25 years later, so So it just yeah, it just opened up an old can of worms, I should say. You know, of just, you know, just how could you kind of thing. And I know I've never been addicted to, and you know, so I can't speak from experience of how the substance could really grab a hold of you. But it was a bit much because, you know, just learning that for the first time at 40, sitting across from my dad was kind of tough.
Yeah.
So just a little.
So we all have a kid in us that doesn't leave. So when things like that happen, it takes you right back to that moment. You know, and that's just I think that's just so important to recognize, because we try to judge it from a place of being 40 and being a dad and being a husband and accomplishing all that you've accomplished. But the real is that little boy or that teenager that happened to then, it felt the same way at 40, at 30, at 20. It feels the same way because that's that inner child in us that still is managing some pain, and it's progressive because you have an understanding as you get older with your life experience, and you begin to understand things from a different perspective. But pain is pain, hurt is hurt, disappointment is disappointment. So when I hear you say that, what it says to me, that little Frankie was that wound kind of opened right back up. And it doesn't even mean that it didn't heal. It healed at the level that it needed to, but it's so significant that it triggered that place for you. And it's so okay. It's so okay, because when you know that you can make some decisions. And, you know, so maybe I've worked on this to this point, but now at this stage in my life, maybe I need to look at it and work on it a little different now, because those are the things that are so remarkable in life. I say this all the time. We have the things that happen to us, significant life events, and then we have the story we come up around that event, and then we develop a truth around that event. And when those significant life events happen and they trigger us, we kind of go back to that old story we made up about it, right? And that was that 15-year-old story, because that was the real of where you were. But because it was so significant, it's so easy to go right back to that place, because it was impactful, and it was one of those moments you kind of don't forget. And so it's a part of the shaping of who you are. So it's important to remember that's that young us. That's that young boy, that young girl that was so impacted in a really deep level by that. And so it doesn't matter how old you are, it still gets triggered. And it's just important to acknowledge that and honor it however it needs to be honored, whether it's a conversation, whether it's just a little quiet meditative something, whether it's I don't know, I really need to handle that with that person, whatever it is, or maybe even getting some support to resolve it in a way that really works for you. But that's that young boy and that young girl that continues to speak out.
That's a wrap.
Oof, Jesus. Girl.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.